England, 1943. RAF Station Thorpe Abbotts. Dawn had not yet broken, but the sky was already red from the glow of hangar lamps. Men moved through the mist with oxygen masks hanging loose and flight jackets half-zipped. Engines coughed alive, one after another, until the entire airfield shook like a living thing. In the middle of the runway stood a B-17 flying fortress named Memphis Belle. On her nose, just beneath the plexiglass turret, was a painting of a woman. Smiling, blonde, one leg bent, arm lifted in a wave. She wore a blue bathing suit and high heels. Next to her, a small tally of bombs 24, each representing a mission. That morning, the crew would paint the 25th. Captain Robert Morgan ran his hand over the image before climbing aboard. Cold metal under fingertips. The paint cracked slightly around her smile. He said nothing. No one ever did. Above them, the Luftwaffe still ruled parts of the sky. Below them, France waited under occupation. The mission was to hit the submarine pens at Lorient, a place where dozens of American crews had already vanished. Morgan's crew knew the odds. 1 in 5 bombers would not come back. Not the same number of men bombers carried 10 apiece. Inside the fuselage, the crew prepared in silence. The ball turret gunner checked his belts. The bombardier adjusted his Norden sight. The radio operator clipped a photograph of his girlfriend to the bulkhead. Outside, the ground crew watched the propellers spin. One of them, a mechanic named Joseph Red Parker, always stared at the painted woman as the plane taxied. He said later, in an interview decades after the war, "I used to think she was watching us go, like she knew who wouldn't come back." At 0600, Memphis Belle lifted into the air. She carried 4 tons of bombs, and on her nose, a woman who never existed, but somehow kept them all human. She was not alone. By 1943, almost every bomber in the U.S. 8th Air Force had a woman painted on its nose. Some reclining, some smiling, some clothed in silk or nothing at all. Names like Shoo Shoo Baby, Misbehavin', Heavenly Body, The Blonde Bomber, Winnie the Pooh. Each one hand-painted, unique, unauthorized, and deeply personal. It began unofficially a bit of paint, a superstition, a way to mark a machine that otherwise looked like every other. But it became something larger. A language, a code, a confession of fear, written in color on gray aluminum. These women did not fight. They did not speak. But they were witnesses to every takeoff, every burning return, every empty runway. When a bomber went down, her face went with it, into the sea or the fields of France. Memphis Belle came back that day. Barely. 2 engines out. Tail riddled with holes. Hydraulics gone. The crew staggered out into the cold, oil-streaked and trembling. Reporters swarmed them. Cameras clicked. Morgan refused to talk at first. Then he looked at the nose art at that smiling woman and said simply, "She got us home." It was not a joke. It was a prayer. A bomber was not a plane. It was a system, a factory of death in the sky. The B-17 Flying Fortress weighed nearly 65,000 pounds, fully loaded. 103 feet. Crew, 10. Armament, 13. 50 caliber Browning machine guns. Payload, 8,000 pounds of bombs. She flew at 25,000 feet, where the air froze lungs and tore skin. Inside, temperature could drop to -40. Engines roared so loud, men went deaf after 10 missions. The oxygen masks froze to their faces. The smell was always the same: cordite, oil, sweat, and fear. There was no glamour, no music, no rhythm, just vibration and monotony. The intercom was filled with short words, technical and cold. Tail clear. Bombs away. 2 engines down. The cockpit was a metal shell surrounded by glass. Everywhere you looked, death could enter. Flak shattered windows, shells punched through wings. The ball turret, the lowest point of the aircraft, was a coffin turned upside down. Gun barrels protruded like insect legs. The gunner could not move when the plane landed. If the landing gear failed, he died where he sat. That was the machine. Cold, functional, unforgiving, and on its nose the soft curve of a woman's smile. Some officers justified the art. It made identification easier, they said. It helped crews recognize their own plane during takeoff and formation. Psychologically, it gave the men something personal to defend, a symbol of ownership and pride. Unofficially, the brass tolerated it because morale was fragile. After 1943, bomber losses were catastrophic. At their worst, casualty rates exceeded those of ground troops in Normandy. For months, missions over Schweinfurt and Regensburg had survival odds under 20%. Commanders knew men needed something to believe in, so they let them paint. As long as the engines ran, nobody asked about the color of the woman on the nose. Back home, these bombers came from the same assembly lines that built refrigerators, typewriters, and automobiles. They were stamped, riveted, assembled by women Rosie the Riveters who filled factories from Seattle to Wichita. Ironically, many of the pinup girls on the bombers resembled those very workers. Posters in the hangars said, "Keep her flying." Underneath was the image of a woman smiling in coveralls. The war blurred the boundaries between reality and imagination. Real women built the machines. Imaginary women adorned them. Both became part of the same myth. The question is not why they painted women. It is what it meant to paint them there. For the men, the nose art served several functions: part superstition, part defiance, part memory. Psychologists after the war described it as rehumanization. The crews faced mechanical death every day. They slept beside engines, ate beside bombs, flew inside machines. Painting a woman, often soft, colorful, sensual, was an act of rebellion against the grayness of industrial war. She represented everything absent from their lives: warmth, touch, home, safety. To an outsider, she was decoration. To the men, she was protection. Many crews named their bombers after wives or girlfriends: Miss Donna May, My Gal Sal, the Lady Luck. Others chose humor: Pistol Packin' Mama, Fertile Myrtle, Milkwagon to Berlin. Each name carried a tone: irony, lust, love, or defiance. But underneath was fear. They painted because they could die. They painted because paint was the only thing they could control. Most nose art was done by crew chiefs or ground crew, using leftover enamel, chalk, or even aircraft primer. Some were crude sketches. Others rivaled professional illustration. The most famous came from magazine pinups Esquire, Yank, Life. The works of artists like Alberto Vargas and George Petty were copied onto aluminum skins thousands of miles from home. The airbrush replaced the brush. Metal became canvas. In hangars, amid the smell of oil, men bent over ladders, tracing curves and shadows. Sometimes the model was a real woman, a photograph from a wallet. Sometimes pure imagination. When the painting was finished, the crew gathered in front of it for a photograph. No smiles, just eyes fixed forward. They knew what it meant. Tomorrow, one of them might not return. The women painted on those planes were not real, but they were not pornographic either. They occupied a strange space between desire and reverence. To touch the paint was considered bad luck. To joke about it too crudely was seen as disrespect. These were not decorations. They were guardians. Icons in an age that no longer believed in angels. By 1944, the air war over Europe had turned into a form of mechanical suicide. Each mission stretched between 8 and 10 hours. Each minute brought the chance of being torn apart by flak or trapped in a burning fuselage. Each man knew his odds. They flew anyway. Psychologists who studied bomber crews after the war called it conditioned fatalism. They no longer believed they would live. They believed only in completing the mission before dying. That psychological shift was visible, literally painted on the metal that carried them. As the missions mounted, the artwork on the planes changed. Early war paintings were bright and hopeful. Smiling girls, waving flags, slogans about home. By late 1944, the smile sharpened. The women became darker, fiercer, almost spectral. Satan's sister, Bloody Mary, Hell's Belle. The optimism of 1942 had given way to something colder, a kind of ritualized defiance. One gunner later said, "We painted her to remind us what we were fighting for. But after a while, she looked more like what we were fighting against, the thing waiting for us if we stopped fighting." The flight to Berlin. On the 3rd of February 1945, over 900 American bombers took off to strike Berlin. Among them was a B-24 named Lucky Lady. Her nose bore a dark-haired woman sitting on a crescent moon, her hand outstretched as if catching stars. Her pilot, Lieutenant James E. Ryder, wrote in his journal, "The boys keep touching her hand before takeoff. We don't talk about it, but no one wants to be the one who forgets." Halfway to the target, flak burst through the formation. Lucky Lady took a hit under the wing. The Bombay fire spread fast. Ryder ordered the crew to bail out. 3 men made it. The rest did not. Months later, after the war, locals in Brandenburg found fragments of aluminum with part of the woman's face still visible. The eye, the smile, the edge of the moon. Rusted, but intact. When the survivor saw the photo years later, he said quietly, "She went down with us, like she was supposed to." The necessity of illusion. What the crews built through their art was not nostalgia, but protection. A kind of mental armor. Every morning, they painted color onto machinery that could explode at any second. Every mission, they climbed into death with a woman's name on their lips. The paradox was clear. They were surrounded by destruction, yet obsessed with life. In that contradiction lay the essence of the human instinct to endure. They did not decorate their machines because they loved war. They did it because they wanted to remember life while killing was their duty. The United States produced over 297,000 aircraft during the Second World War. Each one required thousands of man-hours and hundreds of hands. The same country that made Coca-Cola and swing records now produced death on an industrial scale. But the language of industry efficiency, assembly, uniformity had no place for individuality. Nose art became the rebellion against that uniformity. A small space of freedom in a war of mass production. An act of identity in a system that reduced men to serial numbers. When a bomber left the factory, it was a machine. When it left the ground for its first combat run, it was a creature given a name, a face, a myth. Each painting turned an object into a personality. Each name resisted anonymity. Memphis Belle, Sentimental Journey, 909. Machines, but remembered like people. The pin-up girl on the nose was never purely sexual. She was also domestic. A reminder of the civilian world of movie posters, jukeboxes, postcards from home. Many of the women who inspired the paintings were famous actresses or models. Betty Grable, Rita Hayworth, Veronica Lake. Their images filled barracks and briefing rooms across Europe and the Pacific. To the airmen, they were more than fantasy. They were continuity proof that the world they'd left behind still existed. A world of color, light, laughter, and touch. Even military psychologists admitted it worked. Morale studies conducted in 1944 concluded that units with personalized nose art showed higher cohesion and emotional stability than those without. A plane without a name was a number. A plane with a name was home. When the war ended, most of those planes were scrapped, melted down for peacetime metal. Their art vanished, with them destroyed, ignored, or censored. But for a generation of men, the images stayed. Some kept fragments of painted aluminum hidden in closets. Others recreated the designs on model planes decades later. One veteran, interviewed in 1987, said, "I never kept her picture. But sometimes, when I closed my eyes, I could still see her looking back at me from the nose." The pinup girl survived not as decoration, but as symbol of an entire culture caught between innocence and annihilation. She was the product of two contradictory forces: industrial modernity and primal fear. The 20th century was built on both. Critics later called the imagery sexist, even obscene. And perhaps it was. The women were idealized, objectified, stripped of identity, but the men who painted them did not live in an age of theory. They lived in a cockpit at -40 degrees, staring at death through crosshairs. The question was never morality. It was survival. To them, those painted women were not trophies. They were shields. Each face carried a fragment of what they had lost: touch, warmth, home. Each smile reminded them that somewhere, life was still worth living. In the cold arithmetic of war, that reminder was more powerful than armor. When the survivors came home, they did not talk about the paintings. The country wanted heroes, not art. The pinup era faded into nostalgia, simplified, sanitized, forgotten. The bombers were dismantled, the names erased. But in archives and museums, pieces survived. Panels cut from fuselages. Faded paint sealed under glass. In the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, one panel bears the name Dragon and His Tail. A reclining woman stretches across nearly 20 feet of fuselage, the longest piece of nose art ever painted. It flew 85 missions over the Pacific. The crew swore she brought them luck. When they returned, they signed her name on the tail before the plane was decommissioned. Her paint is cracked now, the colors faded to dust. But the shape remains. So does the silence. The story of World War II nose art is not about sex. It is about the human need to name, to mark, to personalize destruction. From knights painting crests on shields, to sailors naming ships after women, to pilots painting faces on bombers. The instinct is the same: to turn the impersonal into the familiar, to make the weapon an extension of the self, not an instrument of death. In war, men create meaning wherever none exists. The act of naming becomes a form of resistance. The act of painting becomes prayer. Every brushstroke was a declaration. We are still human. The pin-up girl on the bomber's nose was not simply the fantasy of lonely men. She was the reflection of a culture, America, at the height of its power and innocence. A nation of factories and magazines, youth and confidence, sex and sorrow. She was Hollywood and Kansas, steel and lipstick, faith and machinery. She was the face of a country that could mass-produce both destruction and beauty. In her smile lived the paradox of modern war, that men could love life so fiercely even as they learned to destroy it. In 1945, when peace came, the skies fell silent. The pinups disappeared from the hangars. Jet engines replaced propellers. Wars became cleaner, faster, less human. No one painted on missiles. No one gave drones names. The age of nose art ended when the age of distance began. And yet, the idea remained that in the face of the machine, man must leave a mark. That even in the most dehumanized war, there must be a trace of touch, a piece of color on a gray surface, a name on cold metal, a memory in the smoke. In an air museum somewhere in Arizona, sunlight falls across the nose of a restored B-17. On her aluminum skin, a woman smiles again, painted carefully by a modern artist copying photographs from 1943. Visitors stop, look, take pictures. Some laugh, some frown. Few understand. She is not a symbol of lust. She is a relic of survival, a remnant of an age when men met death every day and chose to face it with paint instead of despair. The caption beneath her reads simply, "Nose Art, 1900 and 43. 1945. Morale symbol. Personal identity. Memory of home. That is what she always was. Not an object. Not an idol. A boundary drawn between humanity and the machine. War is a factory that consumes men and produces ghosts. But within it, humans find ways to remember themselves. The pin-up girls of World War II were not the fantasy of war. They were its antidote. They reminded men of a world worth returning to, even as that world burned. Each painted woman, faded now by time, carried the same silent message. We are still alive. And when the bombers rose into the morning fog, their engines howling, that message lifted with them. Into the cold, bright sky, where color met steel, and life met death, and the face of a woman looked calmly out into the storm.